See the numbers are still streaming through. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, it looks like it's stagnated a little bit. Have I got the all clear? I think I do. So I'll get started. Hi everyone, thank you for joining and welcome to this session titled The Impact of Climate Change on Small to Medium Scale Crises and the Role of the Start Funds. My name is Max Wilder and I am a Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning Advisor working on the Global Start Fund. So a little bit of context, in June this year, the START Network contracted a team of 3 researchers to assess the impact of climate change on small to medium scale crises, and broadly speaking, to understand the niche of the START funds in the context of a changing climate. We're really excited to say that this research has now been concluded, and we're hoping that the findings will affect the way all of us work. I'll give you some background on the researchers. So the first is Mike Wiggins, who has extensive experience in climate and environment, including developing evidence-based climate and environmental tools for humanitarians, such as the Urban Nexus Environmental Assessment Tool, or UNEAT. Then we have Marla Mafuza, a resilience and climate justice researcher, activist, and humanitarian. Marla has led local research and action on climate justice in Bangladesh. And then lastly, we have Marcus Oxley. Marcus has been the voice of civil society organizations into UN climate change and disaster risk reduction negotiations. Marcus was also the founding director of the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction. So while we primarily wanted this research to be START Fund specific, we also wanted for it to inform the wider humanitarian sector on the changes that we can expect to see due to climate change, and then also to set out the actions that the humanitarian sector must take in the face of a changing climate. The research will be shared within the coming days, imminently. It's being designed right now. But first, we're really lucky to be joined by the lead researcher, Mike, to present their findings. Mike's presentation will take the same structure as the research report, being formed around the 6 following key themes. So the evolving risk through localization, anticipatory action, early response and early recovery, greening humanitarian action and raising climate consciousness, and also finance and resources. Just to say, there'll be 10 minutes at the end of this session to ask Mike any questions. So please do use the chat and the Q&A functions. Thank you again for joining. And yeah, I hope the session will prove insightful and thought-provoking. Thank you. And over to Mike.
Thank you, Max. Just as we start, if I can just pause a moment, I want to dedicate this research to Professor Salim Al-Hook, who very sadly died over the weekend. He was a world-renowned climate scientist, activist, advisor and friend to many of us on this call, and he generously contributed to this research. And I know that our Bangladesh colleagues on the call will be mourning his loss in particular, as he's given so much to his home country. As Max said, we started this with Start Fund wanted to understand the impacts of climate change on small to medium scale crises, explore their niche, and to look at whether they are already addressing climate change root causes. They wanted this report to be relevant to the whole sector and to Start Fund specifically. Our approach, Max has introduced the team. We had a literature review of over 90 different sources. We looked at the MDAT International Disasters Database, the Desinventar database on small to medium scale crises. We had a desk review of over 10 years of response data. We had a survey sent out to all members. There were 31 key informant interviews from 28 organisations, from local to international, from very much internal to climate scientists, policy analysts, so all sorts of experts who have informed this and helped to make it quite rigorous. And we had 3 focus groups that looked at 4 of the different themes that we've got in the research. The first section of our report is quite a big impact for all of us to consider. We've found that in the context of an increasing humanitarian funding gap, which many of us are feeling, and of course in the countries we're working in, escalating conflict, COVID-19, the Ukraine conflict, now the Gaza conflict, escalating energy and food prices. That's our starting point, and yet climate change is overlaying this. It's exacerbating the frequency and the intensity of floods, droughts, heat waves, landslides, coastal storms, cyclones, disease, and much more. These climate impacts are compounding each other, and they're also compounding with other disaster risk drivers. So they're making the whole humanitarian context we're working in much more complex. We're going to have to get familiar with new terminology. Climate change is causing cascading hazards, where one hazard creates another hazard and triggers yet another hazard, such as we can see in the recent California wildfires, where we thought the problem might be loss of trees or loss of houses or danger to human life, but they were followed by torrential rains, massive landslides, a 5-meter high wave of mud, boulders and tree branches that went through many people's property and killed people. And so we're seeing these complex impacts. I suppose what can underscore this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who are a collection of the world's leading scientists from the majority of countries. Their finding is that climate change is now affecting all crisis types. It's impacting health, ecosystems, water, energy, food, infrastructure, livelihoods. It's impacting everything. They've also found, for those of you that know some things about the sector, that mitigation to reduce emissions will never be enough. We're already in climate change impacts, and adaptation will not be sufficient to temper the increases in crises. Scientists are agreeing that we're now in an era of loss and damage. Loss and damage is destruction from climate change that cannot now be avoided. It's estimated to be 10 times the size of the entire current global humanitarian sector budget in the most vulnerable countries by the year 2030, just 7 years away, and that this is on a trajectory of increasing to 50 times the size of the whole current humanitarian sector by 2050, which is only 27 years away. We all need to, unfortunately, realise that climate change is now the biggest driver of humanitarian crises. Start Fund wanted us to look particularly on the impacts on small to medium scale crises. We found there were insufficient records. We found there was evidence, though, that thousands of smaller scale crises events are going unreported every year. One UN report found that 99.7% of all disasters in a 10-year period were small to medium. So the vast majority are small to medium. And that's defined as less than 30 deaths or fewer than 5,000 houses destroyed. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found that the vast majority of impacts are already small to medium scale, but weather-related crises are spreading to new locations, that there's been a significant increase in what we call recurrent, seasonal, and protracted crises. Climate change is exacerbating disasters faster than scientists had previously predicted, and we're approaching a number of tipping points, such as the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheet collapse, the shutting down of the AMOC, which is linked to the Gulf Stream. And some commentators are arguing that actually globally all countries are now in a recurrent and protracted crisis due to climate change. Our analysis showed that Start Fund is already responding to many of these kinds of alerts in the most vulnerable countries, and that they're very well positioned to continue and expand this. And we would call many of the responses they're doing as recurrent and seasonal. Start Fund asked us to research what to expect in the future. And we found really that the majority of responses will look very similar to how they have in the past, but they will be more frequent, more severe, and more widespread. We're seeing tornadoes that are new to Nepal. We're seeing hailstorms new to West Africa and cyclones new to West Africa. We're finding crises are becoming more complex and interconnected. Any crisis no longer seems to have just one kind of impact, if it ever did. They're impacting food, water, energy, conflict, displacement, protection, health, productivity, all aspects of our lives. We're already seeing shorter planting seasons, more extreme floods, glacial bursts, landslides, and yet we're also seeing, we don't want to blame everything on climate change, these things are all interconnected and exacerbated by other human activities, such as people living in vulnerable locations or deforestation or urbanization. We're seeing that by 2040, almost 700 million people each year will likely be exposed to prolonged droughts. That means of at least 6 months in duration. We're seeing health impacts spread, for example, dengue and malaria spreading to new latitudes and altitudes. We're seeing heat waves called the silent killer, killing very large numbers of people, tens of thousands of people dying in a single week in urban environments, with responders knowing very little about what to do in response. Changes in monsoons, tropical storms, cyclones, disease spread. And we're seeing multiple disasters happening in parallel, environmental disasters in the midst of conflict. So we're going to have to get cleverer at figuring out how to deal with this. We're seeing that slow onsets are the new emergency on a very wide scale. There's slow loss of land, slow loss of fertile soil, slow groundwater salinization, slow increase in temperatures, and this might make us think this isn't a humanitarian problem. However, this is leading to very large numbers of people, massive numbers of people who are losing their homes, their food source, their livelihoods, their security. So this is a crisis that needs our response. We know that the frequency of coastal flooding has doubled already since the 1960s and increasing faster. And we know that more than 1 billion people on the planet live below the predicted sea level rise, so they're very vulnerable. We're also in a context where donors and legislators are changing requirements for us. So we need to do more environmental assessments, greenhouse gas reporting, single-use plastic legislation, polluter pays legislation, and more's expected. Our key recommendations related to this are that the whole sector needs to get informed and take it seriously, that we need to improve our efficiency and our effectiveness across the whole sector through better coordination and collaboration, removing duplication and competition. And that requires faster progress on localization. It requires more anticipatory action, which should be our default response. We need to reduce our impacts on the environment of our own activities. We need to increase our own knowledge and awareness. And we need to be more effective in the way we use both local and international resources. Start Fund's already well positioned on much of this, so it's good news for the ways of working. They're already working in the climate space. And our key recommendations are that it should protect its niche of local decision-making, of rapid response and anticipatory action, but it should increase its knowledge and action on climate change. It should gather data on attribution of climate change on small to medium scale crises to use as evidence, because people are seeking this. It should develop an appropriate response to slow onset crises. And we think Start Fund is well placed to influence the sector to help break down silos between humanitarians and climate practitioners and help align its responses to ensure that any work it is funding is supporting climate resilience and nexus objectives and climate adaptation. The next section of the report looks at enhancing resilience through localization. The increased scale of humanitarian need massively exceeds the capacity of the whole humanitarian sector. We've talked about it increasing tenfold and ultimately 50-fold. We've got to have new ways of working. And the only way we're going to have capacity to do this is to strengthen local response. It's our only option. Studies show that local responders are up to a third more cost efficient than international actors trying to respond to the same crisis. Localization, though, it's not all about just handing over the money. It's about local leadership and about using local knowledge and resources and capacities. However, as we looked at this in our research, we found that when local capacities and resources are exceeded, external support has to be provided. And on the scale we're talking about, there needs to be some kind of automatic mechanism to do this, not just proposals. We haven't got time for that. The people that we interviewed, asking them about localization so far, are finding, as we know, it's too slow. But they're also finding it's mostly extractive with a lack of decision-making rights, that there's misdirected types of capacity building, that there's even attempts to convert them, they feel, into mini INGOs, and all the while ignoring their own skills and experience, and requiring them to take on an unfair share of the burden of the risk. Local actors are asking for capacity building on things like learning exchange, on understanding climate adaptation and resilience. And we know that localization is the best way to strengthen that resilience. Localization, however, isn't about asking all the international actors to close down or go away. They are very, very much needed, but it's a different way of working. We should be looking together for an equal and complementary partnership, seeing how they can fill the gaps, how they can build capacity, how they can go where others are not. Start Fund is already supporting localization, and this is very visible in the Bangladesh and the Nepal Start Funds, where decision-making is increasingly locally led. And I also want to point out that effective strengthening of localization requires understanding how climate impacts women, children, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups differently. Our recommendations on resilience through localizations are split for the humanitarian sector and for Start Fund. The humanitarian sector should rapidly accelerate its progress to localization. It set up mechanisms to easily enable local organizations to access funding directly, ensure the inclusion of diverse and vulnerable groups, encourage complementary partnering of international and local actors, strengthen local capacities in building relationships with government, fundraising and communications, and share risk equitably. For the Start Fund specifically, we would recommend that it continues to strengthen its localization, but focuses this on strengthening resilient communities, that it speeds up the process for local members to join Start Network hubs and national Start Funds, although we know they're already at capacity, more is needed. To influence others to advance localization by sharing success stories, for Start Fund and Start Network to recognise the influence they do have already on other actors and other country-based funds, full funds. To strengthen its understanding of social differentiation, to deepen their understanding of how inclusive localization can lead to greater resilience. Anticipatory action was the next key theme to come out, and the importance we want to emphasize here is about it being linked to early response and early recovery. Traditionally, as you all know, the humanitarian sector would wait for a crisis and then develop our response. And we know that early action can protect assets and livestock and people and reduce the impact on lives, on livelihoods. It supports early response, it supports early recovery, and that needs to be intentional. Anticipatory action should incorporate disaster risk reduction and adaptation measures to strengthen community resilience. The more anticipatory action protects local assets and capacities, then the less impact those crises have on a community. We know that moving livestock to high land will support communities in re-establishing their livelihoods and restoring their protected assets. And these combine to protect and enhance community capacities that are less likely to be overwhelmed by hazards and strengthen their resilience to future shocks and stresses. A community whose resilience is strengthened through anticipatory action linked to early response is better able to recover and better able to absorb and adapt to future risks. Local decision-making enables a more anticipatory humanitarian system, which leads to reduced impacts, and more effective work and early recovery. Anticipatory response informed by improvements in Earth observations and weather forecasting can be effective for responding to a range of recurrent and seasonal crises. We are pleased to observe that anticipatory response is the Start Fund's strength. It's a new strength, and that they are ahead of many other organisations, and this is an expertise they should seek to share more widely. Our key recommendations here for the humanitarian sector is that the sector should scale up and embed anticipatory action and link it to response and early recovery and make it the default way of responding where possible, where impacts can be predicted. We need to stop as a sector having climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction as separate silos. They need to be fully integrated. They're trying to do pretty much the same thing. We need to localise anticipatory response. We need inclusion of the marginalised and vulnerable. For Start Fund specifically, we recommend building on its existing strengths in anticipatory response, being very intentional on supporting preparedness, response and recovery, increasing early warning, developing an ethical response exit strategy with learning reviews to strengthen preparedness to future crises, and to continue learning exchange, which it's already doing with other country-based pool funds. The next area that came up very clearly, which was part of one of the original questions, is to look at what impact are humanitarian organisations having on the environment through their own actions. And so we're looking at greening humanitarian action. And it's important to recognise that our actions do have an impact, whether it's use of chemicals for treating water or plastic wrapping food, or how we dispose of used up or expired health products. There's so many ways in which we have an impact. And the key things we found through our research is that most NGOs who are looking at this, which is not all of them, is that they're having a focus on energy, buildings, flights in particular. And this is true actually across the whole sector, UN agencies, even local actors. And we found that those who feel they are being more progressive are perhaps looking at supply chains and at waste and at packaging. And yet we found that there's a place to go further than that. And that's about localization and about integrating with climate resilience and about working together to build resilience. We found there are many barriers that exist, competing priorities, the humanitarian principle, saving lives and reducing suffering. How does that come first? Where does environment fit with that when there's so much to do that's so urgent? And a lack of clarity on regulations and on donor requirements. But we did note that donors, whilst they're starting to put new requirements in, they're really closely watching each other and trying to align the requirements that they're making of our sector, so they're not overburdening us. And that's another place where international actors can help support local actors. We're finding number of countries are increasing legislation banning single-use plastic, and there are some countries requiring polluter pays principles, where if you do any pollution, you have to clean it up. And we're seeing this increasing, so we've got to become aware of this legislation. We've seen the Swedish Red Cross, the Global Shelter Cluster, share evidence that locally led greening is the most effective, because as we know, local people, they know the context, they know the environment, they know the causes of pollution, they know the capacities of any local waste management, they know whether recycling is viable, and they know that some of the solutions that we propose, circular economy, restorative economy, installing solar panels, recycling infrastructure, whether or not those things are imposing an unachievable burden, or whether there is capacity to do them. And we know that if local greening, reducing our impacts, is treated in isolation, it just becomes an additional activity. Whereas when it's mainstreamed into part of our actual response, and when it's part of how we reduce the impact of disasters, how we adapt to climate change, then the two can be mutually reinforcing. So a key recommendation is to break down that barrier between greening, reducing impact, and climate resilience. So our recommendations here are that the sector should identify and reduce its impacts on the environment, that there should be collaboration wherever any of us are working with other responders to jointly reduce our impacts. It's much easier to achieve this at scale than it is separately. That we should each be working with our supply chains to reduce waste, particularly packaging waste, and we should build capacity of our own organisations and each other on environmental assessments so we can identify the key ways in which we're impacting the environment and reduce them. That we should, as I said, integrate climate resilience and green response. We should prioritise this being locally led, not imposed externally. The Start Fund specifically should be sharing greening tools and resources between international and local organisations. We heard of a number of Start Network international members who have a lot of knowledge and capacity and resources on this, and we heard lots of local organisations saying we don't know of their existence and we don't know how to approach them. Start Fund, Start Network could be convening greening discussions and should be prioritising locally led greening that is designed to strengthen local resilience to climate and to other humanitarian impacts. They shouldn't be separated. Humanitarian systems are not set up to respond to multiple interconnected cascading risks compounding with both climate and non-climate crisis drivers. Some of those words might be new to us. Interconnected, cascading, compounding. These are words we need to learn. Compounding means the risks are impacting each other. Cascading means one risk creates another. And they're interconnected. You can't separate and talk about climate change on its own and then other disaster drivers on their own. They're interconnected. This really helps us understand why we've got this as the next theme, raising climate consciousness. It's not that we all just need to go on a training course. It's that this is impacting everything that we do. We've got to become aware of how it's impacting whatever our work is. If you're a health professional, if you work in shelter, if you are working in protection, climate change is impacting your work, and it's getting to scales where it will undo your work unless your work is made intentionally resilient. The sector is not configured to provide what's required, which is systemic response. Systemic response means not just providing the one intervention, but means understanding how a whole system is affected, so maybe the entire health system or a whole ecosystem. But systemic itself goes further. It's how systems impact other systems. So we're going to have to get cleverer at understanding what the problems are, multiple systems being affected, and what the responses need to be, how we design a response that at least doesn't cause more problems in another sector because of the work that we're doing, and preferably works with across sectors to strengthen for all the work we're trying to do. Humanitarian action is not designed to respond to slow onset crises. I talked about the slow sea level rise, the slow temperature increase, the slow soil salinization. Something called slow onset, as I've said, doesn't sound like humanitarian, especially when it's occurring over decades or centuries. But when we know that the number of floods put into coastal zones impacting urban areas has doubled in the last 60 years due to just a few small centimetres of sea level rise, this is actually causing urgent problems we've got to respond to now. Most humanitarians lack awareness of the scale of the existing climate change impacts that I've talked about. We need greater awareness. Start Fund asked us to look at its own categorisation. And we did find that, as we would find with most organisations, it's unintentionally hiding the scale of climate change. And we have made some recommendations on how Start Fund could capture data in different ways to inform trend analysis and attribution and help it be a bit more intelligent in the way it's responding. Humanitarian actors and even whole countries have raised awareness and strengthened their own resilience. And that's something that needs to be celebrated. We've got countries like Costa Rica, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, who have already taken great strides. They're not waiting for the donors, they're not waiting for the UN or for our Western agencies to respond, they're doing it for themselves. And it's important that we recognise that and that we look to learn from them, not feel that we've got to reinvent the wheel. So our recommendations here. We should ensure that we are informed as a sector on the scale of the problem, recognise climate as a core driver of humanitarian crises, of all crises. We need to break down silos between climate and other disaster types. We need to recognise slow onset as a current disaster. We need to build our climate consciousness. And there's some repetition in recommendations for Start Fund here, that it should protect its niche, but also that it should amend its data categorization, that it should conduct research specifically on climate attribution, support learning exchange between members, encourage knowledge transfer. For example, I'd say in particular from Start Fund Bangladesh across other members and hubs, and consult members on how to apply a climate change lens across all of its work, noting that some of you are asking for a requirement that your proposals, even though it's for short-term funding, show some knowledge or some action or some connection to climate change. So that's something for you to explore. Now, this section, finance and resources, may surprise you. It's not just about money, and it's not just about people. It's about drawing our attention again that loss and damage is going to require at least 10 times the current annual humanitarian budget. It's talking about requiring up to $500 billion per year versus the current humanitarian budget of $31 billion. The current system, as it stands, doesn't have the capacity to meet the need. We need improved efficiency and effectiveness. And that depends on how well domestic and international actors can change our ways of working better together across boundaries. And Start Fund is very well positioned to demonstrate this. Humanitarian actors need to fully optimize all available resources. So we're not just talking about accessing external money. Local actors, local people are the first to respond, and they already have existing capacities, existing resources, existing local funding from local government or from their own resources. So it's about being intelligent in the way we support them and they support themselves in their local communities. And none of this can be done effectively by international actors. When local capacities are exceeded, though, that's when we need the external support. And that can be provided by or complemented by the national and international actors. So we are calling for a different way of working. Making more effective and efficient use of local and international resources requires more effective cooperation between local and international humanitarian actors. Local leadership makes better use of local capacities and resources. The challenge is about getting these external resources down to grassroots level. And we believe that Start Fund can influence this through demonstration, and that Start Fund is uniquely placed to actually inform the ongoing climate change talks on future loss and damage funding mechanisms, which is the talks that are happening at COP this year in November. We think that you could be calling for loss and damage funds to go directly to vulnerable country governments, who would presumably then need to work through their own national local actors to disperse these funds. The Start Fund could be supporting those members to position themselves, to have relationships, to have ways of working, to show that they are effective at dispersing those funds. So our recommendations here: the global humanitarian sector at all levels should collaborate better and more intentionally to be effective and efficient. There's been many calls for reform of the sector, but now really is the time it's got to happen. There should be a move to default locally led responses. That should be our default way of working, recognizing local capacities and resources. identifying and working with the local resource and capacities that exist there. It's not all about external funding, but bringing in the additional support when it's required. And that should be done through automatic thresholds that are agreed, established in advance, whether it's through Start Fund funding or anybody else's funding from the UN or others, to release capacity building, learning exchange when certain thresholds are passed, and funding. And that should include funding of local actors' overheads, which is typically underfunded or not funded. And we should be supporting, the whole sector should be supporting national governments in developing mechanisms for dispersing funds to the most hazard prone, the most vulnerable, the most risk exposed local communities. And Start Fund itself should further progress localization across its own network, and should support local members to support local and national governments in responding to loss and damage. They should support learning transfer. They should, although they're not responding in development or perhaps doing the climate adaptation, they should still check that their work that's funded is supporting triple nexus objectives. And they should consider funding those that are able to demonstrate that they're using the money to leverage other funding or to do nexus work, or that they're doing contextual analysis, needs assessments, vulnerability capacity assessments. This isn't our recommendation. This is a recommendation we've included because it's come strongly from your own members. So that's my presentation. Looking forward, I've summarised on this slide so you can read through it. It's a reminder of what I've just said. And maybe I can hand back now to Max for facilitating questions.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Mike. That was great. So we do have a few questions in the chat. The first one is probably more directed at Start Network. So is it possible to have a link to the report? So the report will be available probably within the next 24 hours, and we'll be plugging it and sharing it on social media. So do keep your eye out for that. The second question is a question for Mike, and it is from Karimi, but there's also a very linked question in the chat from Ekpeng Yong. And the question is, what does more equitable risk show on this, Mike?
There's a lot that could be said on that. I don't know where to start without making this a large session. It's hearing from, some reports that we've read, so this is true across the sector, but also hearing your own local members' voices. They are feeling, for example, that they are the ones required to take the risk if there is an overspend, or if donor outcomes are not met, or taking the risk in terms of going into the vulnerable risk-prone communities. So these are kinds of risks that you're probably familiar with, and there's a concern that in the climate change work, that the risk will be all imposed onto local actors, and that it should be shared, that it should be recognised that local actors have expertise, have knowledge of context, of culture, of what works locally, rather than having imposed upon them certain ways of working or certain financial compliance, which is better borne by the international actors. I think that's probably as much as I want to say. I could probably answer that in writing some other way if that's more helpful. There is more to say.
No, that's great. Thanks, Mike. And then the next question from Inoni is, can you expand a bit more on what is meant by social differentiation? And then C slide relating to enhancing resilience.
Thank you, Inoni, for telling me the slide. I think it was on here. If not, it's on the next one. Yes, the latter point on the recommendations. So yes, social differentiation. So we have found through talking to members and through research in the literature review that often communities are treated as if they're homogenous. And we know that certain vulnerable groups of people in communities might be in the most vulnerable locations. So it might be some ethnic minority or religious minority, or people in greater poverty who live in, for example, flood zones where they're more vulnerable. But then within that, other people are much more vulnerable. So it may be pregnant women, it may be a culture where women are not allowed to leave the house without a man. And so we saw this in the South Asia tsunami years ago, that the majority of people who drowned in their own houses were women. They couldn't swim, they were afraid to leave their own house. But the same for the elderly, for the disabled, or for people who have other reasons they're not welcome into mainstream society. So it's about us not just thinking, here's a vulnerable community, we've done our job, but here are the most vulnerable people within those communities and what are their different needs.
Great, thank you, Mike. The next question is from Ashraf, and it's, do you have any examples of systematic response to compound hazards under climate change conditions?
Well, the thing I would talk about is probably the NEAT tool, Nexus Environmental Assessment Tool, which is hosted by the Joint Environment Unit, which I worked on building, and it's being required by ECHO and now USAID and others for use. Sorry, requested by some donors, required by others. And it tries to take a systemic response. So it has a questionnaire that asks about your entire response, and it looks across all sectors and talks about how you might be responding in one sector, but it's going to have impacts on others. It does then have some other modules underneath it, which look at specific sectors. But for example, we've got protection needs, we've got this social differentiation, we've got livelihoods and economy, we've got aspects of people's health and well-being, social determinants of health. These things are across whatever your response is. So the recommendations will be there, that you're not just responding on, for example, in shelter, making sure you've reused plastic to make sure there's decent insulation, but it would talk about the protection needs or health and well-being needs. So it's trying to be systemic in its response.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. We've only got 2 minutes left, so I think I need to wrap up now. But I think a lot of these questions will be answered in the report, so do please keep your eye out for that and give a read. They're quite fascinating. But thank you so much for your time today, Mike, and everyone else for attending. I'd like to just draw your attention to the next session, which starts at 10:30, I believe, and that's on crisis anticipation and risk financing. Enhancing global initiatives for early and anticipatory action. Yeah, please do attend that. And thank you again.
Thank you.